Well, we're going to get started this afternoon. So good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the TOPCORP Oil and Gas Energy Training Team to today's webinar. This webinar today is entitled Natural Gas, Electricity, and the Texas Snowmageddon, and it's being presented by Dr. David Spence. And Dr. Spence, thank you for spelling Snowmageddon. I wasn't quite sure what the correct spelling might be, so I'm glad you cured that problem for me. We thank you all for joining. To the next one, Dana, please. We thank you all for participating today and registering for this webinar. Top Energy Training, and I know a lot of you are familiar with it. It's an energy consortium composed of the Colorado School of Mines, Pennsylvania State University, and the University of Texas at Austin. TOPCORP is our flagship program. Again, many of you have participated in that, and we're thrilled that you did, and we look forward to those that haven't, that we might have a chance to meet you during these workshops. Hundreds of regulators and policymakers have completed the online 4-module curriculum, along with the in-person training, classroom, and field training. TOPCORP's mission is to train regulatory and policy-making personnel involved in the oil and gas development. Our goal is to make sure that you have that you have time to spend completing professional development opportunities, and we hope to be able to provide that to you. And the next one. Our energy training is well known among oil and gas regulators and policymakers in North America. This success has brought many additional training opportunities as TOPCORP is working to extend our professional development programs to include the development of curriculum to cover all aspects of offshore oil and gas operations and expand our international footprint. And as you can see here, we have many participating partners, environmental NGOs, industry, and foundations that have helped to fund TOPCORP and the educational mission, which is a science-based educational outreach to oil and gas regulators. The next slide. Today's webinar is being offered in part as that effort to promote opportunities for oil and gas regulators, policymakers, and others interested in this subject. As you'll see here, again, if you'd like to introduce yourself, we'd love to know who's attending today. Tell us a little bit about yourself. A note: this webinar will be recorded, and sometime in the next few days or a week, you will receive an email directing you to a link that will hold and archive today's webinar. So in case you know somebody that didn't get a chance to participate, please share the link if this is a topic of interest to them. Our master guru of technology and all things good, Dana Ollendijk, is with us today. If you have any issues with the technology, you'll see her email address there, or use the chat pod, and she will be right with you to solve whatever concerns you have. She's done that for me in spades already today. I'd like to take just a moment before we change slides to introduce Larry Harlan, who is our executive director, the executive director of Top Energy. Larry's got just a couple comments to make. So Larry, I'll turn it over to you for a moment here.
John, thank you. I appreciate it. Just like John said before he introduces Dr. Spence, I just wanted to echo his comments by thanking all of you. We have been absolutely thrilled with the success of TOPCORP in meeting our mission to date. And of course, that is completely a result of your interest in the program, the topic, and your participation. We continue to expand the technology, the subject matter on not only on our online, but also on our in-person presentations that we've done, and of course supplemented with webinars like this. Because of that success, we are trying to expand out even to a broader group of stakeholders. So not just the regulatory community. We are looking to find any and all parties, where it be the public, lawyers, landmen, oil and gas, non-technical executives, those that have a need to learn more about the technology being applied in the field today. we are looking to try to meet that need. As such, we are reaching out to universities, we're reaching out to companies in the industry. And I just want to put kind of a plug in for those of you that interface with those groups. If you find somebody who is interested in learning more about what we teach, please put them in touch with us. And we will definitely be glad to have a conversation about how we can do that. And that would include your own agency. So if you know some people, either lawyers, accountants, HR folks that may not deal with the technology of the industry on a day-to-day basis, but would benefit from learning more, please even talk to your agency heads about this. We've been doing some specialized programming for various states, and we'd be happy to talk to your states to do the same. So John, that's all I wanted to say, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Very good, Larry. Thank you for that. And we'll go to the next slide, Dana. Thank you. We're thrilled to have Dr. David Spence here with us, and Larry was the connection to invite Dr. Spence here today after hearing a presentation that he had made, and I think you'll find this fascinating. But before I turn it completely over to you, Dr. Spence, I'm really humbled to give you his bio, and I'm going to give this to you, and you'll understand his depth of experience and expertise in this subject as I do that. So David is the Baker Botts Chair in Law at the University of Texas School of Law, Professor of Business, Government, and Society at the University of Texas, Austin's McCombs School of Business. Professor Spence's research and teaching focuses on government regulation of the energy industry, broadly defined to include economic and environmental regulation of the entire energy sector. He's a co-author of the leading energy law textbook, Energy, Economics, and the Environment, and one of the principles behind, here's a website, energytradeoffs.com, website featuring research that addresses the complexity and trade-offs associated with the green energy transition. Professor Spence earned his PhD in political science from Duke University, his JD from the University of North Carolina School of Law, and his BA from Gettysburg College. Dr. Spence, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time and your expertise, and we're really looking forward to this. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. And thanks to Larry and to Dana and to TOPCORP for asking me to be here today. I'm happy to share a little bit of information about what we're sometimes calling the Snowmageddon last February that some of us experienced in a big way. And I take it that this talk is a little bit of a departure from other talks, and that I don't claim that it's a science-based technical piece of delivery of information, but we all thought it would be, interesting for people to sort of think a little bit about how the relationship between gas and electricity markets influenced or was influenced by what happened last February. So I'll try to get that across in the next, say, 35 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll have time for questions. Here's a picture that gets produced every year by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. It's intended to show the way energy moves through the economy each calendar year. It's a Sankey diagram. Some of you will recognize it as that. And it conveys both how we use different kinds of energy and how much of it there is going to all the different types of uses. And it's also mainly focused on energy produced in the United States. There's not a whole lot of imports from outside the United States that influence this data. And I want to focus today on the natural gas sector, which, as you know from my introduction, I would call the Carolina blue bar here. It's the light blue bars that go up to the electricity box and also directly to uses by residential, commercial, and industrial consumers. And I've been showing this diagram in my classes for 25 years, and it's instructive to go back and look at earlier pictures because you can see how the kinds of energy we've used have changed over time. And in particular, the gas bar has gotten a lot bigger in the last 20 years or so, and the fracking revolution is a big part of that. In any case, you can see that about a third of the gas we produce here goes up into electricity generation, bought by power plants that generate electricity for the rest of us to use. The rest of it goes to these direct uses, which are mostly heating, almost entirely heating uses, except in the industrial sector where you get some other kinds of specialty uses as well. And if we zero in on the production side of this and the use of gas for electricity generation, which is what we're going to do today, you can see that gas is competing with a bunch of other fuels in the electric generation market. They're selling gas to electric generators, but those generators themselves are competing with solar farms, hydro projects, nuclear projects, and so on. And when we think about, or we want to sort of think about February, it's important to understand the different environments into which natural gas is sold into the electricity sector. Now, when I say environments, I mean the institutional environments in which shape power markets. And so we can make a distinction between traditional investor-owned utilities that were vertically integrated. They generate most of the power they sell to their customers on the one hand, and places where the generation of power is a competitive market. It's not owned by the monopoly utility that serves you power. They go out to the wholesale market and they buy the power. And the United States has been divided into those sort of two, depending on where you live, you're seeing one or the other of these sorts of markets for electricity at the wholesale level. And that's an important distinction to understand what happened last February here in Texas. So here's another way of depicting that same sort of distinction here. The picture on the right is what it used to be like everywhere when I was a kid. Everybody got their power from a monopoly provider of power, and that monopoly utility owned their own generators. They owned all the lines between the generators and the house or the customer. And they didn't really have much cause to buy a lot of power from anybody else. They were allowed to recover the costs of owning and operating this entire system and to earn a fair return on those investments because their rates were set by the Public Utility Commission. And so they could invest in whatever kind of generation was prudent to invest in and be relatively assured that they were going to be able to recover their costs plus fair return on those investments. About 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, that all changed in some parts of the country when the wholesale markets opened up to competition. And the old utilities sold off a lot of the generation that they owned to third parties, and you suddenly had a wholesale power market that was very competitive. And new plants came in and competed with the old plants, and the old plants were owned by different entities now. And the utilities or the retailers who sold power to you and me bought that power from this new competitive wholesale market. So no longer did the generators have a guarantee that they would make their money back. They had to win the competition in the market. They had to find enough customers and sell enough power to make the money that they needed to make the investment profitable. And you can see how that changed the incentives for gas-fired power stations as well as wind and solar, coal, nuclear, and everybody else. That's a different kind of institutional environment. And if you look at where these two types of environments exist, here's a map. All the colored in parts of this map are places where you have this kind of competitive wholesale power market. In these places, these entities known as ISOs or RTOs, so you see New York ISO, Mid-Continent ISO, Southwest Power Pool, California PJM, and ERCOT, which is the market inside Texas. These are the places where the grid operators manage that large regional grid as one. The part that's within their political boundary or their jurisdictional boundary, they manage the grid as one. And they manage both competition among sellers and competition among buyers to buy the power on that market. And they're also the entities responsible for keeping the lights on. So these entities you see here, these organizations, are essentially nonprofit organizations, membership organizations of utilities and others that are involved in the power sector. And that's what they do. They keep the market working and competitive, hopefully, and they also keep the lights on. And you can see as well on this picture that everywhere in the country, on all of these competitive power markets, natural gas is a major fuel. It's an important part of the system. Natural gas fired power is an important part of the system. It is in the other parts of the map as well. It's just that in those places, most of the gas plants and wind plants and nuclear and coal and solar are owned by the vertically integrated monopoly utility. So we don't have a wholesale power market to speak of in those places. It's all done within the company. So that's the situation we're in now in the United States when it comes to power markets, at least wholesale power markets. There's there's two different sorts of situations into which people like you who sell natural gas, produce and sell natural gas, sell that product. So you're selling into these two places, and the economic prospects for natural gas-fired power in these two different contexts are different. They're different because in one context, the gas-fired power plants have to compete with other kinds of generation in ways that they don't in the old context, in the traditional context. So that competition is for being included in the daily dispatch order, meaning the daily competition to supply power to the grid. Remember, the grid is centrally managed, and the people who manage it choose the cheapest power plant mix they can possibly choose each day. So as power demand goes up and down, they have to change, make decisions about which power plants are going to be included in dispatching power to the grid and which ones are not. And they try to do so on a marginal cost basis. The plants with the cheapest marginal costs get included and the others don't. And so as demand fluctuates during the day, and you all pretty much have an intuitive sense of how that works, I imagine. We get up, power demand increases. We go to work, at least power demand at our residences decreases a little bit. We come home, power demand goes up again, and it stays up as long as we're awake, and then it goes down again overnight. And so the mix of plants that are sort of not turned on and off necessarily, but get to sell power into that system changes constantly over the course of the day. And it changes based on marginal cost of selling power from that plant. And marginal cost, for the most part, is fuel cost. For a long time, before wind and solar power got cheap, gas was sort of the cheap, relatively cheap form of generation out there, and that's why it's grown so, and in part so rapidly over time. Nowadays, wind and solar power are the cheapest on a marginal cost basis because their fuel, in quotes, is free. And so they're always dispatched when they can operate. But they can't always operate, right? They can only operate when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. But when that's happening, they get dispatched and everybody else has to sort of step aside and make room for them. Not so in the old markets where the utility can manage which plants get dispatched when and so forth. So gas is taking up a different function. It's a backup function in many places to wind and solar, at least in certain respects. Here's a picture of the latest report on the so-called levelized cost of energy from different kinds of power generation. This is another report that gets published each year, usually in November. And it's from a company called Lazard. These are unsubsidized costs. So this is a levelized cost is basically the power price that plant has to sell its power at over its lifetime to break even. It's a way of sort of comparing the relative costs of generating power from these different plants. You can see that it's a range for all these. The bars represent the levelized cost, and they're a range for all different types of plants. But the sort of headline here is that wind and solar at the utility scale are now the cheapest forms of energy, even on a levelized cost basis, not just the marginal cost basis, but a full life cycle cost basis. They're now cheapest, at least in certain parts of the country, they're cheapest. not surprisingly, the windiest and sunniest parts of the country. That's a big change in our power sector over time. And so the other information you see within the red box here are those diamonds, those gold diamonds, and they are the variable cost of operating those traditional forms of power generation, nuclear, coal, and combined cycle gas plants. And you can see that the levelized cost of wind and solar is starting to get down close to those operating costs for these other types of technologies. So the competitive environment for gas-fired power is changing. It's a lot more difficult than it used to be, which influences the number of gas-fired power plants that are going to be on the grid. They're already leaving, and some are expected to leave in the future. And because we need that power, at least right now, to back up wind and solar, that could be a problem. So turning to the ERCOT Texas story, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little bit here. Here's a picture of the generation mix on the left within ERCOT. Remember ERCOT, which stands for the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Remember that ERCOT covers a part of Texas. Let me go back to that map. That's the black part of this map here. That's ERCOT, Electric Reliability Council of Texas. And that's where the worst of our emergency last February happened. And so if we look to the generation mix in ERCOT, you can see that almost half of it is natural gas-fired power, smaller amounts of coal, and much smaller amounts of nuclear and solar, but a pretty hefty chunk of wind. So because that wind and the solar are variable, not just sort of when the wind completely dies, but over the course of the day, the wind strength varies over time. So it provides variable amounts of power over time. We need that gas to back up that variation in wind. That's an important part of how the Texas grid works. And that keeping that grid in balance, keeping it in balance, meaning keeping the frequency of the electric current at 60 hertz is important because we can't store energy. So we have to vary with the amount of generation or power being dispatched onto the grid in real time with the amount being taken off. So demand has always varied over the course of the day, but now we have some variation in supply. And so that process, keeping that grid in balance, is important. If it gets too far away from that 60 hertz number, it fails. And if it fails entirely, it goes down and it takes a long time to get it back up and running. Just putting aside weather altogether, it takes a long time to sort of restart all the generators. It's a delicate process of restarting them in a particular order on particular circuits to get the grid back up and running. And so what we do when the danger of getting out of balance is too great is we have brownouts. If you lived in California 20 years ago, you may remember the scheduled brownouts or the blackouts to the people who lose power, it's a blackout, right? But we had to schedule these brownouts to avoid the grid failing altogether in California in 2001. And we had to do the same thing last February in Texas. We called it shedding load. Load is electricity industry speak for demand. But we had to shut off particular parts of the system, particular circuits, because of that threat of a disastrous imbalance. And that's what the Texas blackout was. So a little bit more about ERCOT before I get into the nitty-gritty of the blackout. But ERCOT is unusual in a couple of ways. It is a completely competitive wholesale power market. It is so the power that retailers get from the wholesale market to sell to us is purchased from other third parties. It's not anything they own. It's also a competitive retail market. Outside of Austin and San Antonio and a few other places, you can go online, punch in your zip code, and have all sorts of companies from which you might want to buy power at different rates under different contract terms. So it's about as competitive an electricity sector as you can possibly construct. It's the only wholesale market on the grid. It's the only one of those ISOs or RTOs that you saw in that earlier map I showed that is isolated physically from the interstate grid. Those other regional markets have physical alternating current connections with their neighbors. ERCOT does not. Everything that can or has to be done to keep the lights on in ERCOT has to be done entirely within ERCOT. We can't really call on our neighbors, at least in a short-term way, in an emergency to help us out. The isolation of ERCOT is a choice on the part of Texas. First, initially, it was the utilities within Texas, and ultimately it was the government within Texas who chose this isolation in order to avoid certain aspects of federal electricity market regulation that apply everywhere else in the country. And so we have to solve this problem, all of these kinds of problems within ERCOT. It is also the only market in the country that has scarcity pricing. That is, it allows the spot price of electricity to go very, very, very high when the product itself, electricity, is very scarce. Every place else in the country, the wholesale spot market has a price cap of $2,000 per megawatt hour. Here in Texas, it's allowed to go as high as $9,000 per megawatt hour. The reason for that is that Texas doesn't allow wholesale power sellers, generators of power, to earn any kind of payments just for being there. These are called typically capacity payments. Most of the other regional markets do allow their generators to earn money just for being there and being in reserve. These are called, they do earn capacity payments, not in Texas. In Texas, just about all the money a competitive generator has to make has to come from selling power. And so when the logic here is that when power is scarce, we want them to make a lot of money because that will incentivize other people to invest in new power plants and be there and be willing to wait in reserve for the opportunity to make a killing during times of scarcity. Never before last February has that high price, that cap of $9,000, been hit for more than a few hours at a time and for more than single-digit hours per year. So it's not something that happens very often prior to last winter, but it is something that can happen and has happened. It's happened in other places where the cap price is lower as well, but it's the kind of thing we don't anticipate to last for very long, because the assumption is that once people who are sellers on the wholesale market see that price in effect, they will move heaven and earth to get into the market and sell power at that price. And so we don't anticipate it being something that would last long. And you can see that by comparison to the normal price, it's quite a heavy multiple of what normal power prices are. So this slide has some animation on it that comes from the National Weather Service to show you what the weather conditions were last February. It's not unprecedented for the temperatures to get very cold in February in Texas. It happened in 2011, it happened in 1989. What is unprecedented about this most recent storm is that it was not only unusually cold, it was also an unusually large storm in that it covered all of the ERCOT region and more, and it lasted for an unusual amount of time. So that combination of those three attributes was the sort of killer here. It's what caused it was what made this particular blackout such an emergency, and what caused people like me to lose power in the middle of these cold temperatures for about 3 days. And that happened in many parts of Texas. The problem was that once the cold snap hit, we suddenly lost a lot of generation, and it wasn't foreseen by the managers of ERCOT. It was a sudden loss of generating capacity of all kinds. And what it did was it caused the grid to stray dangerously far from 60 hertz, to go dangerously out of balance. And we learned after the fact that we were less than 4 minutes from the grid completely crashing. And so to avoid that disastrous crash of the kind I described earlier, ERCOT ordered its member utilities to, quote, shed load, period, close quote. That means to shut off large circuits, basically put their customers into darkness, some of their customers into darkness. Not all of them. Every utility had some customers remaining with electric service, but the ones that were on non-essential circuits had to be shut off. And this occurred for the better part of, or at least 3 days for most people, and longer for some others. And you can see what was lost. So we lost suddenly almost half the generation that we expected to be available to serve needs during this cold snap. And it was, as I said earlier, all types of generation, but because we were expecting a lot of that to be gas-fired generation, sort of consistent with our typical mix of about half of it. The fact that, that gas-fired, that half of that was supposed to be supplied by gas-fired power plants, just disappeared with really short notice, was a strain on the grid. But we also lost some wind and some nuclear and others as well. So the question is why, and the answer lies in the weather. We had frozen equipment at all the kinds of power plants that disappeared. We also had some power plants, particularly gas-fired plants, that could have continued to operate, but they couldn't get gas to burn because the gas system also experienced similar freezing. So in any place that was sort of upstream of a processing unit before it enters the pipeline, in places where there was still water in the gas system, you saw frozen equipment that caused the system to fail. And so there were interruptions in gas service in many places. So we had shortage of electricity and a shortage of gas in Texas for several days. That caused prices on these wholesale markets to skyrocket. And you can see, we'll start with the gas prices in the bottom right here, but I don't know what gas was heading into the February outage, but it was probably just, a few dollars per 1,000 cubic feet. And you can see that it got up to, $176 or more at certain parts during the crisis, certain times during the crisis. And obviously that posed a strain on electricity prices and on gas prices for people who are buying gas outside the electricity sector. And because electricity itself was so scarce, the price at wholesale of electricity went to the $9,000 cap, as you can see on the upper graph here, for 3 solid days. Now, it doesn't mean that every retail supplier of power was spending that amount for every megawatt hour they sold to their customers. Power sellers, retailers do try to hedge the risk of high power prices. They buy different forms of insurance. They sign long-term contracts with suppliers and so forth. But none of the retailers on the system anticipated having to hedge against a risk like this. So none of them were prepared to fully insure against exposure to $9,000 per megawatt hour prices over the course of 3 solid days. And so what that meant was they all incurred heavy financial losses. This is alongside the physical toll that the blackouts imposed on people. The blackouts actually mitigated the price risks to some utilities because they weren't having to sell power at that exorbitantly high price, but their customers were suffering greatly. I think when all is said and done, we're probably going to find that more than 200 Texans died as a result of this blackout. So we had really important and profound physical impacts and enormous financial impacts that we're going to be dealing with in the coming months and years as a result of this blackout. And to give you a sort of a more concrete sense of what the financial impacts are, if you're a retailer, it could be Austin Energy, which is a municipal utility, could be Blue Bonnet Co-op, which is a membership-owned rural co-op, or it could be one of the competitive retail companies in Texas who you contract with to serve you with power. If you have 5,000 households to serve, in a given year. Almost all of them have at least that many customers. And you have an average power price on the wholesale market over that time of about $40 per megawatt hour times the number of hours you serve in the number of hours in the year. That costs you about $1.7 billion in wholesale power purchase costs to serve those 5,000 households annually. Probably costs you a little more than that because you're buying these hedging contracts that I spoke of earlier, certain forms of insurance against higher prices. But that gives you a sort of a rough magnitude of what the price for these retailers, the prices cost these retailers incurred to serve their customers in a typical year. During the 3 days of the outage, the wholesale price was $9,000. So $9,000 for 72 hours for those same 5,000 households is $3.2 billion in costs, almost twice what you'd spend in a typical year to serve those same households. So you can see how big a deal this is. This is going to involve bankruptcies of retailers. It's going to cause legislators in Texas and regulators of the Public Utility Commission in Texas sleepless nights trying to sort of respond to demands that these impacts be mitigated in some way, that they be spread either over the customer base or over taxpayers, or that the prices in the market be retroactively changed. It's going to be a full employment program for regulatory lawyers and for litigators in the aftermath of this, just like it was after the California electricity crisis of 2000, 2001, because the market, the competitive market, wasn't designed for this. It wasn't something that we really ever expected to happen. And so the participants in the market never would have been reasonably expected to have prepared for it. So that's what we are seeing. We're seeing legislation in the Texas legislature, offering all sorts of different proposals, some of them sensible, some of them not, about trying to deal with this. None of them, no final decisions have been made yet. Because the crisis was so humiliating for our regulators and for ERCOT itself, the board of directors of both ERCOT and the board of the Public Utility Commission had mass resignations, and so they're all shorthanded right now. So the answers won't really be devised in the near term. We're going to see how they unfold over time. When we look back at the causes and and regulatory entities that might be part of the solution, they are many. And so let me just take a moment to sort of explain what I mean on the left-hand side of this picture, and then explain how the entities on the right-hand side can or can't address some of these issues. I've just described power markets to you in really way too short of a time because it's such a complicated topic, but when we get to the solutions here, it's even more complicated. So clearly, we did not weatherize power sector equipment or natural gas sector equipment in ways that we do up north. And we haven't had to. We anticipate the stresses on the system, the physical stresses we anticipate on our system are all on the hot weather end of the scale. We design our system to deal with extreme heat. And probably that extreme heat will get worse over time. Whether or not it makes sense to insure against extreme cold has always been a difficult question. We have had equipment freeze up like this before. If you look at the sort of climate science, there's a disagreement among climate scientists over whether climate change will produce more extremes in a place like Texas at both ends. Some say no, it's just going to get hotter and hotter. Others say no, because of behavior of Arctic air masses in the new climate of the future, we may see events like this again. The fact that 200 people died makes this a really high stakes question. And so far, our politicians, particularly the governor, have indicated that they think we ought to be investing in weatherization for extreme cold. But what that will entail and whether the legislature will pass a bill like that remains to be seen. We just don't know whether that's going to happen. If you want, during the Q&A, we can talk about what weatherization entails, but For those of you that work in the north, we don't have some of the precautions that you typically have up there. The second big question is, should we connect to the interstate grid in ways that would have not avoided the crisis entirely, but would have shortened it greatly and allowed us to get power back on sooner? The $9,000 price that we have as a price cap is intended to represent the value that customers place on avoiding loss of service. And that value is set with relatively short 12, 18-hour outages in mind. But you can see that as an outage extends across 3, 4, 5 days in bitter cold, lives get lost and other sort of really high stakes costs become incurred. And so the idea of building connections outside of ERCOT that would have allowed us to shorten the duration of an extreme outage like this might be worth a lot to us. On the other hand, the idea that we want to go it alone and avoid federal jurisdiction is really deeply ingrained in Texas politics. And so the question becomes, can we build those connections without triggering federal jurisdiction? And the answer is, there's no clear yes or no answer to that. Again, I can get into the details of that if you want during the Q&A, but it's another sort of question we're going to have to face in the aftermath of all this, because it might have, those connections might have saved lives. The operation of the ERCOT pricing rules is going to be another part of the postmortem here. At whether a $9,000 price or a very high price all by itself is enough to incentivize investment in enough generation to keep the lights on during emergencies is going to be a question we face. We've been facing it ever since the market was designed the way it is, but so far we've decided not to have capacity payments for generators or to provide revenue guarantees to build a lot of excess generation. That might get revisited in the future. And then the question of whether the state regulators or the legislature can reprice power after the fact is a difficult one legally. It probably would raise constitutional questions about going back on contract prices. We have, those of you who've been in the natural gas sector for a long time know that we have faced sort of existential crises like that in the gas sector before, where in the 80s, we had long-term power contracts that if they had been enforced would have driven most of the major pipelines out of business. And in that situation, we did sort of share some of the pain of breaching those contracts across all the players in the sector. So it's not an unheard of kind of solution, but we'll see. All the entities on the right have some responsibility for ensuring reliability. Even the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as part of the North American Electric Reliability Council regulatory regime, has some responsibility in Texas, just not the responsibility for regulating prices in wholesale markets. So all these entities are going to be competing with one another and fighting over turf and fighting over how to answer these questions. Hopefully they collectively can come up with answers that work for Texas and help us avoid a situation like this in the future. I was one of the lucky ones. I had another place to go. My son was house sitting about 2 miles away, and his house had power because it was on an important circuit connected to emergency services organizations and hospitals. So a lot of people didn't. And so crafting some sort of solution that helps us not to have to ever live through something like this again in the future is important. I hope we can overcome some of our historical mindsets that allow us to consider fairly all the various reasonable alternatives. And having hit the 35-minute mark, actually gone over a little bit, I wanted to leave 15 minutes for questions. So I will thank you for your attention, and I will stop there.
Thank you, David. Wow, you packed a lot of information into a short amount of time. Thank you for that. And there are questions. So I'm going to sort through a few. I appreciate first Jim Myers responding to someone asking what PJM stood for, and he gave a good response to that. Another question that's there, David, is are utilities in Texas obligated to only buy spot market energy? Can they not hedge their supply costs?
Good question. No, they are not obligated only to buy on the spot market. That was a problem in the California electricity crisis where everybody had to buy all their power on the spot market. We've all learned from that mistake. And so all of the retailers, if they're not required to, but if they're sensible, they will hedge that spot, the spot price. They'll sign long-term contracts with power suppliers to lock in at a particular price. But the problem is everybody has to go to the spot market for some of their needs because you can't perfectly predict how much power you're going to have to sell to your customers. And none of them typically would have thought that they needed to hedge to this degree. And so the little scenario I gave you with the 5,000 households is an overstatement for most of the retailers. It's an overstatement of the pain they would have suffered, but for many of them, it will drive them out of business.
Okay, thank you. Another question out of the Q&A, David, is ERCOT considering a capacity market? And it goes on, there's a couple more kind of comments and questions embedded here, David. Are they considering a capacity market? And if so, will all assets be required to participate in capacity? And this person comments that it's my understanding that this is the case in PJM, with the exception of solar and wind, not requiring participation is also a subsidy, and can stress reliability as non-required asset percentages grow. Your thoughts or comments?
Sure. So let me take the first question. The Texas Public Utility Commission is the regulator of ERCOT. And they have in the past considered whether they want to create a capacity market. On a number of occasions, they even had a docket about it at one point when our reserve margins were falling well below targeted levels. In the past, they have always rejected that idea, and which was not purely just a rejection, but they also said, look, we want to try to address, we recognize this is a problem, that that generators need an incentive to sort of sit there in the background, to be on deck when we need them. And so instead of creating a capacity market, what we're going to do is we're going to make more lucrative the ancillary services market. The ancillary services market is the term we give to sort of short-term reserves. And I mean anything from a few minutes from now to an hour from now. So a capacity market is paying generators to be available at some much more distant time in the future, whether or not we ever buy power from them. We pay them to just be there. An ancillary services market does the same thing, but on a very short-term basis, right? So we decided that we would make the ancillary services market a lot more lucrative, and hope that provided incentives for reserves to grow. And it looked like it was starting to do that. So our target level of reserves was something like 13.75% above summer peak. So that meant we wanted to have that much extra capacity around above our anticipated summer peak. And a couple of years ago, we fell down to like 7.5%. And that worried everybody. And we had a few days that summer where in the afternoon we hit the peak price a couple of times. And so we instead changed the ancillary services market in this way. That is, we pay people a lot more to be available 5 minutes from now, to be available half an hour from now, to be available an hour from now. And it was starting to grow the reserves, and we had decent reserves heading into this year. The problem was that this freeze was so unanticipated and so huge in all ways that probably even some gas plants that might have been built if we had a capacity market, they probably would have failed in similar ways because either they couldn't get gas or they didn't weatherize their equipment. So to a large extent, this is really it's not just how much capacity, it's not just an economic problem here in terms of pricing. the rest of the question was about the controversy, really was sort of referencing a huge controversy going on in the PJM capacity market right now, which is really, really complicated and which is about to change again, I think, with the new Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But basically, there's a lot of fighting over whether the capacity market rules favor or disfavor renewables. And I don't know that I could give, even in all the remaining time allotted, a reasonable explanation of that would make sense, except to say that the parties are fighting over it right now, and it's pretty intense fight. And I have no idea whether we would create a capacity market here if we did that mimicked those kinds of problems.
Okay, good, thank you. And thank you for that, because we do have 3 or 4 or 5 more questions, and we probably won't be able to address them all. And just before I get to the next question, Dana has put up a poll, and I would just ask you all as participants, if you'd take a moment and respond to that. It certainly helps us as we go along and do more webinars to refine them and address issues that you'd like to have addressed, and to make these better each time. So if you just take a moment and respond to the couple poll questions Dana's put up there, we'd appreciate it. So and following with the next question, is there a notion that the SARA was off by around 9 gigawatts? Would not more gas plants have been online? Well, let me finish there, stop there.
So a lot of the postmortems have talked about what should have been reasonably anticipated by the various players. Everybody knew a big Arctic blast was coming, but my understanding, and I'm not a meteorologist, but my understanding is that the most intense, so you know how you've all watched weather reports, right? Where the weatherman or woman shows a little animation of the Arctic blast tipping down and coming across your area. And in this case, up until a little under 24 hours before it actually hit, the darkest blue part, the really, really super cold part, was anticipated only to touch North Texas and the Panhandle. And at the last minute, it dipped lower. You saw the animation I showed. It stayed well below freezing for more than 3 days. And so I think there is now whether ERCOT should have done something something different once that revised forecast came in is a fair question. And whether what was avoidable, what parts of the problem would have been avoidable is also a fair question. And I imagine in the hearings that will take place in venues representing almost every entity you saw on the right-hand side of that last slide, I think we're going to get at those questions. For those of you that live through the polar vortex in the PJM region, by the way, PJM, I get that question a lot about what PJM stands for. It's like KFC, no longer means what it meant if it's just PJM now. But this may look like we made stupid mistakes to people who lived through the polar vortex in PJM, because there were sort of coordination issues and other freezing related issues that people learned from after that, and Texas didn't anticipate the need to apply those lessons here. Let's put it that way. And whether they should have or not is an open question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. A question from your area, from Austin. The person says, I heard there's a priority for residential gas service. Could you speak to the priority to residential natural gas as an example for fireplaces and cooktops that got us through the blacktop? I have a friend in Dallas who has a generator at his home that uses a direct natural gas feed. Why does the priority exist for residential natural gas? And do you know if these residential natural gas generators are very popular? And I guess
I've never heard of that kind of generator. I always assumed it was, gasoline or something. So I don't know the answer to whether they're popular. That's right. There are, written into the Natural Gas Act, there are priorities for what's called curtailment, right? So there are certain users that get priority when there is a shortage. And they are what you would imagine: hospitals, schools, and residential service before electric power plants. Now there's a good question now about whether that makes sense, right? Because as more and more of the energy we use is used in the form of electricity, we might want to revisit that. And furthermore, a lot of our natural gas power plants have interruptible service. Generally, they pay less for gas because they buy an interruptible service contract. Whether we want to change that as a matter of policy is another question. In Texas, we have a lot of intrastate natural gas that can be delivered according to rules set in Texas. In other words, we don't have to worry about the Natural Gas Act rules for those intrastate pipelines and gas that's entirely in the intrastate system. So these are all policy questions that, I mean, it's a really good question because I could cook on my stove. I had a gas fireplace, and for a while I sat next to it. And, you know, I didn't realize that you shouldn't do that for too long, like for all day or whatever. But in any case, I was happy to have it, right? So other people that had all electric systems were a little bit worse off in that respect. It also helped me boil my water during the boil water emergency.
We are down to the last couple minutes, and unfortunately we have a couple more questions, but I'm going to ask Dave one that you raised and suggested that we might have time, and I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about what would weatherization of some of the system look like that you alluded to happens in the north that maybe hasn't taken place there.
So I'm gonna answer with the caveat that what I know about this, I learned from being on other panels at this. I'm not an engineer, and I've been to plenty of power plants, but I don't build them. So, so there's a lot of different little things that you can do to mitigate the effect of extreme cold in power plants. Some of them have to do with building essentially enclosures around particular pieces of equipment. Some of them have to do with the insulators you would use in fluids in the equipment, and other little things like that. So we're not talking about super high-tech answers. And the same thing is true of all the other technologies, not just natural gas plants, but there are weather packs, cold weather packs for wind farms that involve changing the oil, the viscosity and the insulating properties of the oil in the system. So there's all kinds of little things like that. And the question is, for us in Texas, is do we want to do those things? Because some of those things exacerbate heat-related problems, right? So not all of them, but some of them. And so that means we would have seasonal changes in the way these plants are run. And so the question is, how do you make that decision? Do you estimate how much it would cost and then, attach a dollar value to lives lost and make a benefit cost comparison like that? Or how do you do that? And so these are the kind of questions we're going to have to answer. But my understanding is that these are all fairly low tech things, but when you're doing them on a massive scale, it collectively can be an expensive proposition.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And David, as you started the presentation, you said this might be a little off, different than some of our other webinars and presentations. And you're exactly right. And by the same token, it was absolutely fascinating. And you did pack a lot of interesting information into this short time period. So thank you for that. Thank you for being with us. And thank you for our participants, who registered and attended. And again, pass the link along to anyone that you think might be interested in this. I'd ask Dana, if you might go to the next to the last slide, if you can, if you have a moment. And if not, I would just like to end by saying, if you enjoy these and they serve a good purpose in your professional development, we have the next webinar scheduled for June 22nd. Dr. Steve Bryant from the University of Calgary is going to be with us talking about all things emissions. I think another really interesting bunch of information from an expert in the field. So mark that on your calendars for June 22nd. And with that, if you have any, thank you for attending. If you have any questions or needs from Top Energy Training, Our real main point of contact is Dory Coy. She's our project manager, and if everything else fails, she is the one that's on top of it all. So give Dory a call or an email. With that, thanks again for participating. Dr. Spence, thank you for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. And we hope you all have a good and safe afternoon. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.